From having controversial views just for the sake of it to being blatantly wrong about climate change and the Me Too movement, here are the dark sides of Jordan Peterson's psychology. Now, if there's one thing you know about Peterson, it's that he's often the guy with the most controversial take on any given topic. And for a lot of his followers, especially the conservative crowd, that's a big part of the appeal. People see him as this sort of hero who's finally voicing out all the issues they've got with society nowadays. Whether you agree with the guy or not, I'm sure you can see how Jordan is not only aware of this fact, but he even makes use of it to further boost his own popularity. I mean, how else could a professor from the University of Toronto basically become one of the leading figures in modern philosophy and social discourse? Peterson's trying to appeal to his audience through his discussions on personal responsibility, and the meaning of life does come across as a tad manipulative, don't you think? You could even call it pandering, but hey, that's not to say his message doesn't truly resonate with his fans. After all, there's a reason why he's got millions of followers on social media. But don't let that large number fool you. Not everything Jordan says has been well received. In fact, there have even been moments when his listeners straight up went against the things he said. And one of the biggest reasons behind this is that Peterson speaks about almost anything people want to hear about. I mean, the guy's a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology, but you'll often see him making statements on political science, biology, philosophy, or even the economy. Now, to the layman, what he's got to say might make a lot of sense, but actual experts in these respective fields have often brought up Peterson's statements and shown why he's wrong. Take, for example, his views on climate change. In early 2023, Peterson gained a lot of interest in the topic, publishing multiple interviews on it, each lasting more than 90 minutes. Like most of his other interviews, his fans were quick to watch these, resulting in the videos gaining millions of views overall. Now you'd think that with someone who's talking on the subject so much, he'd have something of value to say. But this again goes to show the dark sides of the psychology Peterson uses to gain more fame. He might be actively misleading folks with his outdated and frankly incorrect views on the topic, but as long as it's gaining him the admiration of his followers, he goes along with it. And that's not just me saying that. That's what climate change experts have called him out on. In 2022, climate scientists gave him some pretty harsh criticism when he went against how climate change models worked. Peterson claimed that these models were mostly useless. He mentioned that these models are stretched across time, which makes the errors inherently present in them increase radically. So, while you can predict the weather that we're going to have next week or even a year from now, the fact is that extending that model over to 100 years is bound to lead to errors that will compound like interest. Now, if you're someone with little to no knowledge about climate change, what Peterson said might seem like he's right. Some might argue that it's a completely logical take, but that doesn't change the fact that it's fundamentally wrong. Dr. Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick, a climate scientist at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, mentioned that Peterson has completely failed to grasp how climate change models even work. For one, he's making the mistake of confusing weather and climate. Sure, weather forecasts have issues with long-term predictions, but the way these experts derive their data for long-term climate change is completely different. But of course, Peterson had no idea about that, and neither did his millions of fans who just parrot his views without doing their own research. Dr. Sarah also hit the nail on the head by saying that while Jordan sounds intelligent, he's actually completely wrong. She mentioned that Peterson's argument is that you can't predict if a pot of water on a flame will boil just because you don't know the details of each individual bubble forming. What she said definitely woke up some fans of Peterson, making them realize that the guy isn't always right on every topic he decides to speak on. But it still wasn't enough. Some still think Jordan is some sort of authority figure in the world of climate change when he really isn't. That said, it did lead to a lot of people trolling him on Twitter and other social media platforms, especially when he continued to appear in more interviews about climate change, like he's some kind of expert. One fan even pointed out that his statements during his Joe Rogan interview felt like he was trying to make a parody of himself. Joe talked about how climate change is a weird topic to sort out, and in response, Peterson replied back with, "Well, that's because climate doesn't exist." Some, let's just say former fans, even compared his statement with the kind of wisdom you'd see from college students in their 20s who are completely out of their minds. Now, if you're just now finding out about Jordan's bizarre comments on climate change, you might find it weird how a seemingly knowledgeable figure could make such blatantly wrong statements. But you would be surprised at how frequently Jordan does this. Just take a look at some of the arguments he made against the Me Too movement. Peterson wasn't a fan of the whole thing, and he mainly had two major critiques about the movement. The first was that the proportion of men who were actually committing these acts was very small, so it's unfair to lodge all men into that category. He also mentioned that there are no clearly defined rules as to what counts as harmless flirting and what crosses a line. This kind of vagueness leads to a lot of people being falsely accused of things they didn't even know they committed. At the height of the Me Too movement, both of Peterson's arguments were easily refuted by professionals. I mean, the first one is basically just the typical "not all men" response in prettier wording. While he's right that not all men are responsible for the acts that led to the Me Too movement, just pointing that out felt like it was an attempt to delegitimize the movement. It also completely ignores the larger social and cultural backdrop that has allowed these actions to take place for so long. As for Peterson's second point, many people called him out for this statement straight up coming across as creepy. Fans said that a lot of the time, it's not that hard to notice if someone isn't into you, and a guy who is unable to take the hint can't just go around blaming the woman for it. But that's not the only thing fans disagreed with Peterson on. Some folks also asked him what his suggestions for these clearly defined rules should be. So, that every man and woman are on the same page about what's acceptable and what isn't. And obviously, Peterson didn't really have a response to this, because the fact is, no matter how much he might have complained back then about the vagueness, most people don't need a long list of rules telling them what's wrong and what isn't. They just know those who didn't deserve to be called out for it, and that's why the Me Too movement happened in the first place. Despite the backlash he got, both from experts and from some fans, for his wildly inaccurate statements, it didn't seem like Jordan really changed his mind on the movement all that much. But honestly, that much is to be expected. He's shown time and time again that keeping up this persona of being a critical and out-of-the-box thinker is more important to him than actually being right, even if it means making blanket statements about an important movement or outright misleading his audience about topics like climate change. That's why some folks have begun tuning him out entirely. To be fair, this isn't too surprising, especially if they are someone who's researched a lot of his statements to see if they're actually right. That said, I think his core audience will likely still stay attached to him. His main talking points, after all, seem to be designed to keep them hooked and agreeing with him. It's why he's continued to have controversial rants on Twitter about absolute non-issues, making them out to be massive problems that are much more important than they really are. If you go through some of Jordan's tweets, you'll notice he'll often make completely outlandish statements, maybe just as a way to remain in the public eye. And while at some point it might have gotten him a ton of fans, it's clear that people are starting to see the patterns and are now beginning to ignore him. It's even made some folks question his own identity as some sort of intellectual thinker, and it has left them wondering if Jordan Peterson really has no idea what he's talking about whatsoever. So from being blatantly wrong about climate change and the Me Too movement to having controversial takes just for the sake of it, those were the dark sides of Jordan Peterson's psychology.